Last summer, Irene and I met some people in Western Alberta. My aunt introduced us as living in Toronto, and one older gentleman immediately responded by saying, in a tone of disgust, "Toronto?" Now, I haven't heard that many comments about Alberta and Toronto, but I have certainly heard comments about Hamilton, Scarborough, Timmins, and if there's one thing people here and out west can agree on, it's making fun of Winnipeg. This phenomenon has been named by sociologists as the relationship between in-groups and out-groups. Your in-group is those you identify with and favor, and your out-group, in contrast, is those you exclude and mock. Sorting people into in-groups and out-groups is one of the oldest and most popular human activities. It's therefore no surprise that it shows up in today's reading. Paul's letter to the church in Rome is written around the year 56. About a decade before that, the Roman Emperor Claudius took the radical step of expelling the Jews from Rome. Why did he do this? Because of political tensions between those who believed that Jesus was the Messiah and those who did not. The emperor did not care who was right and simply deported them all. Then in 54, Claudius dies, and the new emperor, Nero, lets everyone back in. However, time has passed, and the church has grown. And the new members of the church are primarily Gentiles, because of course most Jews had been barred from the city in the interim. The returning Jewish Christians are therefore rejoining a community that has grown and changed in their absence, including with people who exclude and look down on them. Just imagine, you go away from church for a few years and you come back and someone is in your seat. The new members of the church are primarily Paul is aware that he is writing a letter to a divided community of Jews and Gentiles. He also recognizes that he needs to be careful to prevent his words being used by Gentiles in the Roman church to put down their Jewish brothers and sisters. Previously in the letter to the Romans, Paul has been critical of his own people and they're stumbling over the message of Jesus. Now, in the first verse of our reading today, Paul asks a rhetorical question. Has God rejected God's people? No, he says. Paul then defends his own pedigree as a Jew to justify his claims here, and finds an illustration in the Old Testament story of Elijah. We don't talk about Elijah often, so let me give you some context. Elijah is discussed in the book of 1 Kings, which chronicles the decline of ancient Israel. Old King David dies and is succeeded by his son Solomon, who levies heavy taxes and conscripts his people to do forced labor. Top it all off, Solomon starts to promote foreign gods as well. Solomon's successor is even harsher, which leads to a separatist movement in the north, revolting and splitting the country into two halves, north and south. The northern king, Jeroboam, is clever and recognizes that if his people still go on pilgrimages to Jerusalem in the southern kingdom, that king will have more legitimacy than him. Thus, he forcibly converts his people to worshiping two golden calves, which he claims were responsible for bringing them out of Egypt. In other words, Jeroboam inflames religious differences to help him maintain political power, a classic move. Jeroboam is succeeded by one bad king after another until we get to Ahab, who doubles down on the whole foreign gods gambit. He builds an altar for the worship of Baal, a god from his wife Jezebel's homeland in Sidon, found in modern-day Lebanon. Just as a side note, if you noticed in the gospel reading, the woman who asked Jesus for help is also from Sidon. Now enter Elijah. Elijah steps out and tells Ahab he is a bad king. He then wins a competition to be Israel's next top prophet, showing everyone the one true God he worships is more powerful than any of the prophets of Baal. Ahab and Jezebel are not impressed by this, though, and they threaten to kill Elijah just like they did the other prophets of God. Elijah is quite reasonably afraid, and he hides in a cave until he hears a gentle whisper asking what he is doing. Elijah says he has done everything he could for God, but Israel has trashed God's altars, murdered God's prophets, and are going to kill him too. As you can imagine, Elijah's feeling pretty sorry for himself. God's reply, I have kept for myself 7,000 who have not bowed to Baal. In other words, you're not unique, get over yourself. Now, I'm not sure if God's response to Elijah follows the best practices for motivating your employees, but Elijah experiences this as a huge relief. He realizes that God has other faithful people, and he doesn't need to be single-handedly responsible for everything. Back to our letter. Paul quotes this exchange between Elijah and God as precedent for the situation in Rome. Yes, some Jews as a whole have rejected Jesus, but not all of them. There is a remnant chosen by God's grace. Paul then sneaks in a little verse that will become quite significant. If it is by grace, it is not on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would not be grace. Grace here stands for God's kindness in choosing people not because of anything they have done to earn God's favor. That would be works. But rather because of God's own kindness and mercy. Now, we could discuss this verse for a long time. It ends up being quite crucial for Luther, the Reformation, and the past 5 centuries of the Christian church. But in this letter, Paul is simply trying to prevent one group from looking down on another. So, to that point, he's cited Elijah, he discussed grace, but many of the new Christians are Gentiles, and they may not know all of these stories. So for their benefit, he switches to a topic that everyone in the Mediterranean cares about, olives. Olives grow on trees, which are often grafted. Grafting is a technique for joining parts of 2 plants. Imagine that you have 2 trees. One has good fruit, but weak roots. The other has strong roots, but no fruit. If you cut the shoots of the fruiting tree and graft them on the roots of the other tree, you end up with a strong tree with good fruit. Paul uses this ancient practice to describe the relationship between Jews and Gentiles in Rome. Speaking to the Gentiles, he says, "You are a wild olive shoot that has been cut to be grafted into the rich roots of a cultivated olive tree." Paul then tells the Gentiles not to gloat or become arrogant towards the Jews. Yes, he says, to graft you in, some of the cultivated olive branches have been broken off. But you too have been cut from your original tree, and you are flourishing now because you are fed by the rich strength of the root, which is God. Paul then warns the Gentiles about the possibility that God could cut them off again. This sounds ominous, But I think it's mostly directed at their pride. Put another way, he's saying that you're not inherently better than the Jews. You're just currently benefiting from God's cultivation process. Your seat in the church is not earned because you got here more recently. Paul then ends on a note of hope. He notes that grafting the natural branches that have been cut from the cultivated olive tree back into the original root is even easier than grafting wild olives in. Thus, he concludes, God can and will graft the pruned branches back into God's people. God does not reject God's people, as he said at the beginning. So we've got emperors, Elijah, olives. What does any of this mean for us today? At the start, I mentioned in-groups and out-groups. Sometimes our division into groups can be harmless. I don't think that the rivalry between the Ottawa and Toronto hockey teams is about to fall into violence. But sorting people into groups can lead to oppression, war, and genocide. And tragically, religion is no exception here. The Reformation alone helped unleash an absolute bloodbath across Europe. Yet, Paul's letter to the Romans here is an attempt to diffuse tensions, undermine gloating, and unite different groups. He says that neither Jewish nor Gentile Christians can boast. Their membership in the people of God is thanks to God's choice, God's grace, not any achievement of their own. If Paul was writing to the church today, I wonder what he would say. Would he tell Mennonites not to be proud of their music? Would he tell Lutherans not to boast about their theology? Would he tell Anglicans not to gloat about our liturgy? Would Paul say that we should not trust in our fruit, but in God's grace, God's root? Would Paul say to us that we are chosen by God? Would Paul say that we are not alone? I think he would.